Shalom everyone, you're here again for another episode of Torah Mikra. As always, I want to thank you for joining me again. And don't forget to visit HebrewInIsrael.net to see all the material that I produce. And also, Facebook. And if there are any questions, you can go to HebrewInIsrael@gmail.com and email me. And this week, first of all, I'm recording most of these recordings almost back to back at the moment because I have a bit of spare time. And the thing is that you might send questions about previous recordings or something, and we'll be able to address them because I'm just basically trying to push all the recordings out. And the thing is that basically for Torah Mikra, I actually started in the book of Bamidbar. Those were very short recordings, about 15 minutes, 20 minutes max, because some of them there wasn't really much to talk about because these were repetitive sections. And my plan is to finish Vaikra and basically finish with Torah Mikra. It's been a year. I've actually done 3 consecutive years of discussions on the weekly portion. I did 2 years with Talking Torah, which at the moment I've been doing kind of sporadically, but I've been doing a program about oral Torah, especially the first 5 or 6 episodes I think were the most interesting, at least for me. Though we're kind of like walking more into discussing things about the beliefs in Judaism and so on. And I think the next episode, when we get around to doing it, unfortunately, I think that Jeff is having some difficulty with internet, so he hasn't really been communicating with me. So if you can please pray for him that things kind of settle down where he lives and he'll be able to continue doing his work. I think the next episode is going to be about what Jews expect about the Mashiach. Now, there have been several rabbis who have actually done recordings like this, but none of them are historians. So there actually is a lot of things that I can say about this, especially throughout the centuries. So I think that I'm going to contribute something here that no one else has ever done. The moment we won't be actually able to produce the program, I'll put it out. But even the last episode that we did, which was a discussion about Maimonides and principles of belief and authority, isn't even out yet because I think he's unable to upload them. But in any case, I'll be done with Torah Mikra, and then I'll start a series. I have a few ideas what I'm going to be doing. So the moment I decide which one of the plans that I have that I have cooking, which one of them I choose to go for, you already know because you'll see the episodes. But the one thing is that I want to start shifting back to what Hebrew in Israel originally was about, which is a discussion about Hebrew Semitic languages and Bible in context. So I'm not going to limit myself to the weekly portion. I've done several years of this. There are dozens and dozens of recordings that I've done on the weekly portion, and a lot of recordings about little specific sections. There's also a whole series about Joshua, Judges, and half of the book of Samuel, basically 1 Samuel, that I did with Truth to You. So you can go to those websites, you can listen to what I've done there. For people who follow my work who are more inclined towards the New Testament, just remember that the work I do is very neutral. So if you see anything on those websites you don't like, it has nothing to do with me personally. It has to do with the owners of the websites. But the material that I put out there is very, very neutral. And my approach to everything is very neutral. I rather focus on what we have in common than to focus on what differs us from one another. And obviously, there have been people who argued with me, and don't worry, this actually connects to this week's portion, so you'll see in a second. There have been people who've argued with me over the fact that I go and I speak with groups who are not Jewish, and sometimes groups which are very, very Christian in their orientation, and groups which are less Christians and Hebrew roots, and what have you. And my position on this whole subject is that if the person believes in the God of Israel, and they have some other background idea, I rather focus on the fact that they believe in the God of Israel than to focus on the fact that they believe in the spaghetti monster. It's not what I care about. Yes, I do sometimes open up my mouth and say, listen, there's something wrong with this idea, Especially, for example, if someone says, oh, besides God, there's a spaghetti monster, and that's another God. Okay, that's already a problem for me, because that's against the Ten Commandments. That's a very clear prohibition. And that's also one of the main things that we hear from the prophets when they attacked what was going on in the first temple. And but on the other hand, if a person shows up and says, I believe that there's only one God, and then we have this other extra thing, I think that it's reasonable to say, okay, let's focus on what's common. And, but the type of walk I walk here is a slightly difficult one, because it puts me in a funny position when it comes to almost everyone. I, in my nature, am a person who does not like conflict, though try to put me into a corner and you endanger yourself. But the point is that I believe that dialogue is a very, very important element in discussing things between people who are not necessarily enemies. If a person is threatening my life, then diplomacy is out of the window. But the thing is that I think that we have a lot in common. We can talk about things, but obviously there are people who are afraid. Fear is a very powerful driving force in human nature, and it scares us, and it causes us to become isolated from one another. And I'll say something very simple. As much as some people don't like the Pharisees understood one very simple thing. You can't lock yourself up and create your own little sect and hide there because it feels comfortable. You have to be involved in the world that surrounds you. And it's a well-known thing about Jews, that Jews are very practical people. When you put away all the nonsense that people invented about Jews throughout the centuries, at the end of the day, when you look at what happened historically with Jews were always accepted by the more rational people, such as governments and businessmen and so on, because they knew Jews were very, very practical people, very down-to-earth people, and that the religion of Judaism is a very down-to-earth religion as well. There's even a funny story that I read a couple of days ago, actually brought by a non-Jewish historian, but a Roman historian, about a Jewish soldier who was in one of the armies, one of the Roman garrisons. And they were traveling around. Obviously, the Romans had soldiers from all over the place, and there were a lot of people there who believed in a lot of weird things. And one time they were preparing for something, and they saw these birds flying in the sky, and some of them interpreted it as a bad omen. And it started really causing a big stir in the camp. So this Jewish soldier just pulls out his bow and arrow, shoots the birds down, and said, okay, now the birds are gone. Can we carry on with work here? And that's kind of the mentality a lot of Jews developed. And the thing is that being very down to earth and being very practical and realizing that you can't lock yourself up in different places is a methodology that I've accepted throughout the years. Though for a very long time I did believe in like this uber spirituality where I am I'm joining this inner circle of holier than thou type of mentality. And I got out of it very, very quickly. Now, I was very young back then. I was in my late teens, and I was, being dragged into Judaism of a very, very particular nature. And I got out very, very quickly. And since my very early 20s, I started becoming a very rational person, though obviously I don't put aside spirituality and striving for holiness and striving for, being better, stronger, faster in my faith in the Almighty. But the thing is that you can't lock yourself up, and you can't ignore the fact that you need to be very down to earth about certain things. Now, obviously, being down to earth sometimes is not always what you have to do. Sometimes you also have to walk in faith, and that's really when my wife and I got married, we literally had nothing. I mean, I was homeless for several years, and my wife comes from a family that does not have much money, and we anyhow got married, and we said, listen, we're going to walk in faith here because we didn't say love will prevail. We never said that, but we said, listen, eventually things will figure itself out. And I can attest that, throughout my relatively short life, I've had a lot of turns and twists and so on. But things did eventually work out, and I landed some really good jobs throughout the years, and everything worked out. And these days, I do what I do in the structure of Hebrew and Israel, and a lot of amazing people that I've met throughout the years, especially for some very specific individuals who pushed me forward and told me to strive for higher things, and I really want to thank them. And for example, one of them is a very, very big teacher in the Hebrew Roots movement called Rico Cortez, that we've been friends for over a decade. I think it's been about 12 or 13 years, and I think it's 12 years. And he was one of the people that pushed me. But the thing was that if I didn't lower my defenses and decide to speak with this person who was obviously from a very different world, and I didn't lock myself up before this guy, and he persisted. We have a very funny story how we met. But if he didn't persist and I wouldn't lower my guard, I wouldn't be where I am today. He was one of the catalysts in my reality. And that's the thing, we have to remember that sometimes, focusing on the positive will bring us to better places, instead of fearing, and as fear is the path to, if you can borrow from Star Wars, the path to the dark side. And it's very, very true. And people who are fearmongers, people who go around trying to tell you lock yourself up from everyone else because you're some kind of holier than thou thing, it only destroys the world. It only destroys the environment that surrounds us. And obviously, you don't have to give up your principles, but you need to be down on earth. And we see this with everyone. Elisha, if we take the contrast of Eliyahu and Elisha, Elijah and Elisha, they're very contrasting characters. And I actually have a plan to discuss the story cycles of Elisha and Eliyahu, and discuss them also as parallels of one another. That's going to happen in the future, because as you remember, I'm a history major, and one of the main books that we study as history majors in specifically the history of the Bible, you learn the Book of Kings. I've taken entire classes just on this subject. So yes, just to clarify this, when you say history major, yes, I have to study histories of different periods and different cultures and everything. But as my degree is designed in an area where it really focuses a lot on the Tanakh, and you can take the historical approach to the Tanakh, which is what I did here. But then, for example, you can also take more the literature approach to the Tanakh, which means you study more how things are written and things. And I've taken classes in those areas as well. But I wanted to learn the Tanakh as a down to earth, very practical based thing. So I take archaeology and I take history, and understanding the cultures around us and everything. And so that's just to clarify what does it mean a major in history. It's really, excuse me, it is a degree in biblical studies, but it has a very strong focus on history. But in any case, we take Eliyahu and Elisha, and these are two contrasting characters. And I believe that when stories are picked, they're picked for a reason. And this is an understanding a lot of scholars have. And they're picked for a reason. The reason is that they're trying to give us a message. I find it very interesting that Eliyahu, being the one who locked himself away from everyone, and he has this weird look where he has long wild hair, and he wears a leather belt, and he wears a skin with hair on it. He's trying to look different than everyone else. And then we have Elisha, who actually lives in a house, and we have descriptions of living in a house, and he travels around the country staying with people, and he interacts very closely with people, and he even joins this group of prophet students, which is a very interesting subject of what these groups were. And they're very different from one another. And Eliyahu actually travels then to Mount Horeb, and there's a very interesting book about the contrast between Mount Horeb and Mount Zion, and actually written by a friend of my brother, I was very surprised to discover my brother was a friend with this professor. His name is Levinson, and it's called, I think it's from like Sinai to Zion or something like that. And it's very interesting that Eliyahu goes back to the most basic element level of the covenant, And he's actually told, listen, you can't always behave like this, and he's taken away. And there have been attempts to explain why was he taken away, and one of them was that he wasn't fit into the time, he was too extreme. So you need to show a certain flexibility. And Elisha was a person who interacted closely with kings and other characters, and he was more a practical person, standing his own ground, but also realizing you can't lock yourself away from everyone else. So how does all of this connect to this week's parasha? So last week I mentioned the sphere of holiness, and this parasha is known as Parashat Qdoshim, and it actually starts with verse 2. It says, Daber kol adat bnei Yisrael, speak to all the congregation of the children of Israel, and which means kol adat bnei Yisrael, which probably includes every last person, including women, because we have it's a very hot topic, the whole thing of segregation of women. I, as a more historical Bible scholar, I'm going to openly say that the segregation of women existed back then, but it had a different reality to it. People didn't shun women away. It was an issue of not allowing women to be in certain circles. But we find that women that were capable did lead communities and their families. So it's very important to realize that back then, women had rights, but on the other hand, women were considered to be, I wouldn't say lesser, but people saw the nature of women being more the mother of the home and so on. And it was very respected place. A mother of children who leads her children. This is a very respectful thing. So there's a very strong cultural contrast here between what we have today, what we assume or people assume as Westerners, because it's very difficult for me to call myself a Westerner because I live in the Middle East, and our culture is kind of different than Western culture. But in our culture, for example, a mother of children is especially boys, is a very, very respectful place, and a woman is respected because of her household. And if a woman is also very wise, then she's respected for that as well. So it's untrue to say that women were not respected, but on the other hand, it's also untrue to say that women had equal rights. So there is this interesting balance here. But we also need to remember that there was a time in history where women were actually a lot more respected, and Mother Earth, the principle of Mother Earth, actually shows that people respected the idea of childbirth in a very serious way. So it's a very interesting subject. There are entire books written about this, not from a feminist perspective, by the way. I avoid those books because I think that they deliberately distort information. I think it's an unbalanced view of things. But we need to remember that at the end of the day, women were part of the holy sphere of Israel. Women were part of the honor of the people. For example, there is a reason that women were the singers in different ceremonies. Women were the singers in public ceremonies. Unlike what we find today, for example, in Jewish circles, women actually sang the laments and also sang the songs of glory, and women were the glory of the people. If the women were respected, then the entire congregation is a strong one where there is respect to that congregation. If women have the ability to be strong, it means, and obviously not undermine the rest of the congregation. Feminism has a well-known psychological problem where instead of trying to balance out immediately, it goes to an extreme and then it balances out. But it doesn't matter. This is a very complex subject. For some people, very, very touchy. But in any case, the thing is that women here, because it refers to the entire congregation, women are also part of the holy sphere. Women are not segregated from the holy sphere. Women are part of everything. And almost any commandment that can apply to women applies. And any women can become prophetesses. And I'm even sure the pluralization of prophetesses. And women can become leaders. We have a few examples of women that function as leaders. And we have songs of praise to women and everything. So we find that women are a very, very, obviously a very strong and integral part of this sphere of holiness. And it says, Qdoshim tiyu kadosh ani Adonai Elohechem. So first of all, you'll be holy, for I am For I am holy, I am the Lord your God. So first of all, this kind of defines us where holiness actually comes from. Holiness is something which is very, very difficult to define. It's the same thing of like trying to define God. The Bible avoids defining God because we don't really have the ability to fathom what God is. But what we find here is that the source of holiness is God himself. And we are to imitate God in our deeds. And this is the key thing. Unlike what we call, spiritual, if I can borrow the word, religions. It's very difficult to use the word religions when it comes to old faiths from the East. Because the term religio, which is a Roman term, means really a system of beliefs which is considered to be acceptable. Unlike superstition or superstitio, which is a belief in things which are nonsense. And the Romans had this method of defining, if something was acceptable, they would call it religio, and if it wasn't, they would call it superstitio. I think I'm probably butchering the Latin here. And for example, Judaism for a very long time was referred to as a religion, as a religio, and then when anti-Semitism came up, especially because of politics. And by the way, when people talk about if we get rid of religion, there'll be peace in the world, the answer is that's not what's going on. That is a very superficial way of looking at things. The wars between people is politics. Everything is politics, and I can tell you as a person who slowly studied the period from the move from hate, from admiring Jews to the full-fledged, the full hatred of Jews, it's politics. I can point out to documents that clearly indicate this. It's all about politics. It has nothing to do with religion. Religions that don't have politics in them are religions which are very peaceful. But in any case, the holiness is a very, very difficult thing to fathom, and it happens because it really comes from God. It's something that we bring into our world. Being creations of the Almighty, we actually have the ability to bring holiness into our reality. But what's very interesting here is, unlike religions of the East, where holiness comes from sitting on some mountain somewhere, or hiding in some monastery somewhere, or whatever it may be, or swirling around like a dervish, or whatever it might be, in Torah, holiness is achieved through deeds, through being very down to earth, by being practical, by doing actions that make the world a better place. Holiness is not an arbitrary term when it comes to bringing the holiness into our world. It's done through action. Remember, I mentioned earlier practicality, being very, very practical, and doing things in a way that judges the world that surrounds us through the world itself, instead of inventing some spiritual, Care Bear type of way of looking at things. You need to focus on doing deeds. You need to focus on the covenant, and the covenant is built through deeds as well. And what we actually find here is very interesting with chapter 19. This is a very, very short parasha, by the way. It's really only 2 chapters. One deals with a series of commandments of do's and don't do's, cramped up next to one another. Many of them connected to the land. Some of it really feels like as if we're being referenced back to the 10 Commandments. And we have here a section that deals with avoiding certain sexual promiscuity behavior, which I'll deal with today. And really, going through this parasha, if I want to explain, there's no way to explain anything here in general. There actually has to be a very detailed discussion here. But we find keeping, honoring the father and mother. This is the first thing that we find. Verse 3. A man should fear his mother and father. The mother is to be feared first. Why does the Torah say this? There's a very interesting rabbinic commentary on this that says that a man naturally fears his father, but does not naturally fear his mother. But on the other hand, a person loves his mother and therefore respects her. Well, the father, you can have a lot of conflict with the father. And therefore, Torah in Ten Commandments says, Kabet avicha v'et imecha, honor your father and your mother, because it's easier for a person that's nursed properly by his mother to honor her for what she's done for him. But fathers is always this conflict. So Torah, one may argue this is for the sake of variety, but also it's quite possible there actually is a hint here to something else, and a man needs to fear his mother, basically to create equality between the father and the mother. You have your parents, but where does holiness begin? This is the thing. I find it very interesting that the honoring the father and the mother, which is a social structure, it's a social subject, is equated together with keeping the Sabbath. This balance between keeping in the real world and then also entering the sphere of the Sabbath, which is the day we set apart for God Himself. And it's a day that we commune with God, and we find, for example, if we go back to the stories of Elisha, the child that he resurrected, when his mother goes to meet up with him and call him, her servant says to her, "Lo chodesh v'lo Shabbat." It's not a moon, it's not a new moon, it's not a Sabbath, which indicates that on the Shabbat people also would go to the prophet, which shows very strongly the yearning for spirituality that we find on the Sabbath day. And this is why communing and sitting together and studying and singing and trying to elevate ourselves. This is that day where we don't do things in the physical world. We do holiness throughout the entire week by serving God and working in the land and doing our everyday life and being a sign to everyone else, people that surround us. Doesn't matter if you're Jewish or not. The point is that you show justice and righteous ways in front of everyone, and kindness, that you bring holiness to the world. People see, for example, if someone falls in the street and you run up and you pick them up and you help them walk and everything, you're bringing goodness to the world. You're actually bringing holiness into the world. But we see here that Ishim Ohev Tirao, you have to fear your mother and your father, which is some of the most basic social structures that we have. It's like the whole thing I mentioned, maybe I mentioned it somewhere else, but the whole issue of adultery. Why adultery is so severe? Because it's not only breaking covenant between a husband and wife and oaths and things like that, and also for us naturally, this is my wife, or this is my husband. What is this? It also has to do with keeping order. You have to go back to Genesis and think about the creation of order in the creation, and the Sabbath being a symbol of that, by the way. And also social structures, the most basic, a husband and wife are loyal to one another. Children and their parents work together. They don't break off of one another. And then that expands more and more until it goes to the entire universe. The universe, holiness comes from keeping order, by keeping things in their right place, by not creating disorder. Anyone that tries to create disorder, anyone that tries to undermine the laws of nature, anyone that calls for destruction, is actually from the exact opposite side of reality, from the exact opposite side of the creation, which basically means they are, if I may use this term, they actually are the other side, or what some people call Satan, if I can use that term. They oppose God by wanting disorder, by wanting destruction, by wanting to destroy everything that surrounds them. And by the way, this does not contradict the fact that God also sometimes stands up and punishes people and there's destruction there, but that's from Him. That's what He decides to do. That's God's decision. But from our standpoint, we are not allowed to create disorder in the world. We are not allowed to destroy the universe that surrounds us. That's why, by the way, I'm very pro preservation of water and preservation of land, and don't throw your garbage anywhere you can. I've never thrown something on the floor. I openly admit this. I am mentally incapable of throwing something onto the floor. If I have a wrapper or something, I will put it in my pocket and look for a garbage can, literally. And it's something that these are things I believe in. I believe that we do need to preserve nature around us. I deliberately, for example, don't own a car. Besides the fact I don't like the idea of driving, but it's also an issue of I think that there are too many cars on the road. but we're starting to go a little astray away from what we're discussing here. So that's, for example, verse 3 is a very interesting, just one verse, a very interesting contrast that exists there. He goes over, for example, don't worship idols. So now he's going more detailed into the covenant itself. Don't worship any idols. If you do any sacrifices, you need to burn that sacrifice after the third day. These are probably more shlamim, more peace offerings. And if you eat it, this is actually, it's very interesting. I find it very interesting that this is a very unusual commandment, that it says that if you eat the sacrifice after 3 days or on the third day, it's actually the punishment here is karet, and I've never ever understood this one. This is one of the stranger ones for me. Why is there a karet if you wait your sacrifice 3 days? But maybe again there's an issue here of maintaining a certain order, that if you're going to stay a couple days in the area of the temple, you might make a mistake on the way somewhere. So it's trying to make sure that you keep yourself in the rightful place. And the truth is, I'm mostly guessing here. It's a very, very strange prohibition here that I've never fully understood. And what's very interesting here, then, from verse 9, he goes into like very simple everyday life. When you harvest, always leave something out there. When you pick your fruits, always leave some for the poor. Keep taking care of others, taking care of the poor, taking care of the widow, taking care of the Levite, taking care of the fatherless. A yatom is usually a person that's considered to be fatherless. It's a very interesting thing, because a person has a father, so he has someone he can lean to. The father figure in the Tanakh is the person that's your warrior. He's your hero. He is the one that's the protector of the family. He's the one that bears the sword of protection of the family. And therefore, if the father is not there, the social structure of the family falls apart, because the woman, at the end of the day, I've met women who can beat me up. I literally have. Women who are highly trained in different martial arts, or even women who lift weights and everything. Women that I would never walk into a ring with. With all my size, being 6'2" and a very large person, very, very strong, there are women that I will never pick a fight with, especially, for example, my former sensei. And but at the end of the day, that's a minority. The majority of families, the husband, the father, is the protective character. And this is why, if a person is considered to be fatherless, then we actually have a social problem with the family. There's no one to put an umbrella name and a protection over the family. That's why they're considered to be fatherless. This is why it's considered to be fatherless. But if you have a father, then you're not a yatom. If you don't have a father, you are a yatom. But the mother is a little bit outside of the picture. Then we have here, we even have the ger, which is the term ger. I've explained this before, but the term ger is a person. It's more of a social status than anything else. This is not what we call convert today. Today people turn into, they're following Torah now, they're converts. No. A ger does not mean convert as we mean it in the modern meaning of the term. A ger is a person that has a social status of a person who is not part of Israel. This is a person who lives with us. This is what the word gal, actually, ger really comes from the word gal, which is in the root gul, which means to dwell. Not to confuse it with gul, which is to fear. This is the thing, roots. You have to be very careful how you use roots of words. This is a person who is equated together with the poor and the widow. And these are people that are protected social. They have a protected social status because they are not protected by anyone. There are strangers here. These are people. It's like, for example, you go to the United States and you have people who fled from their homeland for whatever reason it is. Those people can be considered a ger as long as they respect the laws of the land. The moment they disrespect it, then they have to be thrown out. And that's the thing. A ger is a person who also accepts the social structure of the community that they've joined. Which means if a person shows up and they march into a community and they say, "Oh, this is going to work," you're not a ger. you're a usurper. You're basically going to throw you out. So again, keeping order. Then we have not harming one another, not stealing, not lying under oath. Lying under oath. Taking the name of God in vain, and it's very important. When someone says the name of God, it's not taking the name of God in vain. Taking the name of God in vain is to use things which are considered to be vain, things which are lies. Using God's name in something which is a lie. And some people even expand this to, for example, witchcraft. There was this practice of invoking the name of God in sorcery. And that was also considered to be in vain. I think that's also possible, but the main focus we find about taking God's name in vain is mostly in false oaths, because people had to actually say the name of God when they took an oath, because this was the highest authority you could answer to. And this is the thing, people say, oh, you're not supposed to invoke the name of God. No, it's the opposite. You are supposed to invoke the name of God, and literally the tetragrammaton, the four-lettered name, when you take oath. So if there was any reality you ever actually did use the name, if you argue that they didn't throughout their lives, if there was one reality that a regular person would have to invoke the name of God besides prophets and priests, was when you took an oath, because that was one of the mechanisms they used in the ancient world to regulate people in trials, that they take the risk of using the name of God. And this was common in the ancient Near East in general, and some of the practices that we find in the ancient Near East was even by grabbing, this is what Prop says in his commentary on Exodus, even grabbing, in other cultures, grabbing an idol in their hands. In Torah, there are no idols, and you can't grab a hold of the ark or anything, because that's prohibited and it's also dangerous. But we find invoking names of gods when you by grabbing an idol or something. So if there was any, as I said, if there was any reality that you did use the name of God, it would be here. And there are a lot of social things here. Also not cussing a deaf man. Now, obviously, this could be taken as a pshat, which means a person who's deaf or blind, you don't mislead them or you don't cuss them. But this can also mean, also in a metaphorical meaning, that the person is deaf, that they give them advice that's incorrect, or you speak ill behind their backs. You have, for example, or a person who's blind, they don't know what's the correct advice, or they literally can't see. And then we also have, for example, verse, and this is a very, very important verse, verse 16, which is about, it says, "Lo telech achil be'amecha," you will not go as a merchant in your people, which means rachil is from the word rachal, which is to be a merchant. But really what it refers to here, the understanding is, because of the continuation of the verse, "Lo tamar adam re'echa ani Adonai," you will not stand on the blood of your brother, I'm the Lord. So there's a discussion here if these two sections are connected to one another or not. But the understanding of what rachil is the understanding that this is what we refer to today as Lashon Hara. And I've seen people misuse this term Lashon Hara so many times. There was even the whole story of Yosef Mizrahi a couple months ago that blew out of proportion, and people were accusing one another of Lashon Hara, and people were accusing one another of not knowing what the halacha is and everything. And I kind of went into this as well, and I knew I was right, because when it comes to Judaism, I'm very well educated, and I've studied a lot of systems, a lot of different things, and I knew that what he did was prohibited. I knew that what he claimed was, what he said, not only being historically inaccurate, but also was forbidden. But people jumped up to try to protect him, people which I openly say are stupid. The stupidity that came, I rarely use this word, the stupidity that came out from certain people about this term was so harsh and disgusting that I actually went out my way to openly attack some of these people online, because Lashon Hara is not whatever you want it to be. It's not your way you plug people's mouths closed. There are certain discussions you are allowed to do, especially if it's done in public. If a person stands up in public and says something publicly, that's their problem. The moment you do something publicly and everyone sees it, that's already an open debate. Rachil means that you take information from one person privately and take it to another person privately. If I have a personal private discussion with someone and they share with me something personal they have, something which is very personal to them, or they share with me secret information or some business idea they have and they tell it to me in secret, and I go and I start talking to everyone, that's Lashon Hara. The Talmud clearly states, and I'm openly going to say, I don't agree with the Chafetz Chaim with his interpretation. I'm not saying this for myself. My rabbi actually said this. When I discussed the deal, he saw me with the book of the Chafetz Chaim, and I started speaking with him about it, and he said to me, you have to be very, very careful with the Chafetz Chaim, because his method is to take everything to a more extreme point of view. If you take everyone else, they completely disagree with him. So the Chafetz Chaim stopped being a book that's important to me, because it really is a very, very, very extreme interpretation of what the law is. And when you look at the Talmud, it's like very, very short sentence. And there's a very interesting statement there that if something is done in public, if more than two people know about something, it is already public information, therefore is not Lashon Hara. Lashon Hara is not arguing with people. Lashon Hara is not saying something that's an attack on someone else. That's already just bad form. It can also be something as being motzi shemra, when you falsely accuse someone of something, which people do all the time. The people who run around yelling out Lashon Hara are also the people who do motzi shemra, are the people who falsely accuse others of things that never happened, or things that were never said. So it's very, very important to understand what this law is. The term itself, lo tilech achil be'amecha, if I take the meaning of the words, and this is, by the way, what the Talmud also understood, even rabbinics also understood this way. Lo tilech achil be'amecha is taking private information from one place and putting it somewhere else. If I, for example, take private information and make it public, that is Lashon Hara. But the moment someone puts information out in public and they open up their mouth in public and more than 3 or 4 people see this, it's public information. That's already their problem. If they're the ones, if I go out and I start talking about myself, that's my problem. But if someone hears information I give privately in confidentiality, and that's Lashon Hara. And then we have the term motzi shemra, which is basically blatantly lying about things, which we see it mostly as a law that we find. It's the expression of it in the Torah is when someone lies about a woman that he marries and claims she's not a virgin. But we can learn from that on much, much bigger things. But that's what Lashon Hara really is. And it doesn't matter which lessons you hear. If it's based on the Chafetz Chaim, you really have to be very, very careful with it, because he takes a very extreme interpretation. And there are also, I keep on hearing this from certain friends, that are people that use this term Lashon Hara as an umbrella term to shut people up. And I think that's basically bullying. That's literally bullying. We have a lot of things in not hating your brother, but also remembering to tell your brother. He says, that, you're not supposed to hate your brother. But on the other hand, on another end of this spectrum is also that you also need to tell your brother when he is wrong. And it's interesting, he uses the word achicha and amitecha. You need to remember that there is a mutuality here. We can disagree with one another, and you might see someone doing something that's forbidden, but it's not your job to start yelling and screaming in public. You walk up to them quietly, you speak with them, you try to explain to them why they're wrong. And I, for example, one time had a friend that did something I thought was wrong. So instead of yelling and screaming and making a whole fuss, I walked down and said, I saw you do this. Are you assuming this or maybe this? I kind of took a very, very subtle approach about it, and he explained why he did what he did. I was like, oh, okay, fine, and I accepted what he said. And that's the thing. Telling people that they need to correct themselves doesn't mean take your Bible and smack them over the head. That's not what it means. That is not social justice. That is not social structure. That is bullying. And I hate bullies. And I'm glad the Almighty made me 6'2", weighing almost 300 pounds, where most of it is muscle. There's a reason that the Torah makes a point of don't bully your brother. Today, I was bullied as a kid, so there's also a personal issue here. But today when I see people bullying one another, I feel I'm less fearful of stepping in, because I walk in and I'm taller than the average person here, and sometimes people are afraid of me, and then they discover I'm a nice person. But the point is that you're not supposed to bully one another, especially people hide behind keyboards today. I want to see you try to say that to my face, and really that's the thing. It's easy to bully people. It's easy to be nasty. There are people who have committed suicide. There are people that have caused others to commit suicide. That is murder. If you cause someone to die because of your behavior, this is borderline murder. It's a very, very dangerous thing. People need to learn to respect one another, and this is what holiness is. Keeping balance, keeping things in structure, keeping, not going haywire, not allowing chaos to take over. But unfortunately, that's what goes on. And people say, oh, you don't need the Torah anymore, or, these religions are primitive. These religions are what kept society going. Yes, there was bloodshed and everything, but believe, even without religion, there's still bloodshed. Okay, it has nothing to do with religion. It has to do with human nature, with politics, and people just loving chaos. There are loads and loads of things here. There's a lot of things that we can talk about here. There's the whole thing here of what tattoos. I actually wrote something about tattoos and shaving. You can actually go to my website and see it. There's two things, beards 1 and beards 2, and there's also a subsection inside I think it's beards 2. There's a little subsection there about tattoos. The one thing I want to already say is tattoos have absolutely nothing to do with worshiping the dead. There's a problem with these chapters where the text jumps around from one principle to the other, making it look as if these things are linked to one another. There are some verses where the entire verse is about one subject. Sometimes the verse is about other things. It's a very awkward way how the information is placed next to one another. But historically speaking, from a contextual perspective, there is no evidence whatsoever of writing names of gods or tattoos as some kind of idol worshipping until the Roman period. So that's obviously thousands of years, not thousands of years, but hundreds of years after the writing of the Torah. So it's actually, no, I would say over 1,000 years. So it's very difficult to argue that tattoos have anything to do with idol worshipping. It's connected here to the sphere of holiness, which means don't cut yourself. We have descriptions. Don't harm yourself. Don't cut yourself. Shaving the beard is not really shaving. It's destroying the beard. It's pulling it out. It's scarring the face to prevent the beard from growing. That's something we actually hear from the Tatarians. They used to cut their faces to scar their faces to prevent the beard from growing. Cutting oneself, as we find again, if we're going back to Eliyahu, to Elijah, not cutting oneself when it comes to worshiping. And these all things are connected to one another, but the tattoos is really, there's really more of an issue here of basically harming yourself, cutting yourself, damaging your body. So I find the idea that you're allowed to have tattoos as long as it's not for idol worshipping, I find that argument to be very, very, very difficult and probably completely incorrect. The last section that we have here, which is basically very similar to what we have in chapter 18, which is last week's parasha, has to do with inappropriate sexual connections. Now, there's not really much to explain because these things are pretty straightforward. You have, again, social structure here of not breaching internal social structures of families. You have a husband and his wife. They have children. And when the children marries off to another family, the moment there's a marriage connection between some of these families, they become one larger family. And then inside that structure, there are obviously people you are allowed and people you are forbidden from laying with. They're not even talking about marriage here. We're talking about basically straightforward sexual behavior. But what's very interesting here is there are several things here which are very, very different than what most people think they are. First of all, cousins. In the West, marrying your cousin is considered to be a very dangerous and very problematic thing and is frowned upon. In Eastern cultures, cousins married. And it was a very good chance that you would marry a second or third cousin because people mostly married in the area they lived in. So there wasn't really much choice. The only people who married outside of their smaller circle were people who were rich. They would marry another rich family. Then we have, for example, the deeds of Egypt, K'maaseh Eretz Mitzrayim, which I don't think is even mentioned here. I think it's really mentioned in chapter 18, but I'm going to read these two as if they're one. And there are actually also some differences between them. But for example, the deeds of the land of Canaan, that's highly debated, because we know that the Canaanites and the Amuru in general did have laws that forbade people from laying with relatives, though we do find in some of the places in the Kodesh HaMurabi where certain things the Torah forbids, the Kodesh HaMurabi actually allows certain sexual connections which actually are considered to be forbidden in the Torah. We find them that they're okay, or you're not really punished for them if you do them. So there is a little bit something, but the Egyptians is the more interesting thing, because first of all, historically speaking, we actually know that the Egyptians had a very, very developed sexual awareness of themselves, and there actually there was these papyri discovered with very explicit images in them. And apparently they were one of the very few cultures that actually made a big deal out of sexuality. But what's interesting, for example, is don't marry your sister. In Egypt, it was very common, and also even in Europe, this became very common, is that relatives married one another to keep the pure blood inside the family, and that obviously led to some deformations. And there's this ongoing joke. I've never checked if this is real, but there's this ongoing joke that there are royal families in Europe that some of them can't leave their homes because they're so deformed. But we do find, at least from the Hellenistic period in Egypt, that the Ptolemaic family married the kings married their own sisters to keep things in the family. Now, by the way, marrying your own sister was mostly used as a tool to prevent any issues of inheritance or people trying to usurp the throne. You kept things in the family. And that was the real purpose of it. It had nothing to do with love or anything. It had to do with staying in the family, keeping things in the family to prevent any leakage of power and wealth. Again, we have a lot of things are pretty straightforward here, but there's also the famous example of marrying sisters. This is again something that we have, if I remember correctly. I think it actually appears in chapter 18. It says, I'm trying to find the exact verse here. Yeah, verse 18, chapter 18, verse 18. Now, from around the Second Temple period, we actually hear of a commentary by one of the sectarian groups that you're not supposed to marry more than one wife. And there's a whole discussion about the way some of the pronouns are used in some of these verses. But the thing is that we know as a fact that people did practice polygamy. So I have a tendency to say this is more to do with marrying sisters, which was something which was acceptable in the ancient Near East, and we even find this with Yaakov. He married sisters, but the moment the Torah was given, that practice was made forbidden. So you can't use the example of what was going on with Yaakov, because Yaakov was living in a time prior to Torah, and therefore it was actually allowed. But then the Torah comes to forbid this. Now, obviously, there are some people who want to argue this actually means don't marry more than one wife, and I understand where they come with their argument. But I think that the term achot here is actually to be taken literally. Sometimes isha lachota is like isha l're'ehu. It's like a term that we find in other places in the Tanakh where man to his brother. It doesn't literally mean his literal brother. It means brother in the sense that they have a closeness to one another. Here, some people try to apply that argument as well. I think here, because of the lore meaning nature here, there has to be something a bit more literal here. It's very, I don't think the text would use such a poetic term in a legal structure. So I have a lot of doubts about saying that polygamy is forbidden, especially because we do find people who practice polygamy throughout the Tanakh, and there was no doubt about it. But we also have to remember, people ask me a lot about how is it that Yaakov married two sisters, the Torah forbids this. Again, this is one of the things that proves that the stories of Yaakov are pre pre-Torah given. So, for example, another example that we have is, for example, levirate marriage. If we have the case of a levirate marriage with Judah lays with his bride, which the Torah obviously says is forbidden. But Tamar knew that this was her father-in-law. So why would she do something which she knows is forbidden? It's because at that stage of history, the law was that levirate marriage could expand beyond the brothers into other relatives. When, for example, it can even expand to the father. We find, for example, with Ruth, it expands to cousins and everything because there's no one else. So that's one thing. These are still types of marriage that which we can find are still acceptable. But Tamar lays with her father-in-law. A lot of people raise their eyebrow about this, but really, when you look at levirate marriage, as it was practiced at the times of the laws of Ashnona or Lapitishtal and other law codes at the time, and especially if you look into the Nuzi tablets, you actually find that they would expand levirate marriage even to the father-in-law if there are no sons. So he's really the next of kin, and that's why they did this, and this is why they were both not found guilty. But Judah, knowing that this also this was an act that was also not But pray this. There's a verse that says that he never knew her again. Why does it say this? I think first of all, it's for writing. The text has been written to people who live after the giving of the Torah, and they all raise their eyebrows at this. Obviously, I think that there's always a cultural deficit that happens throughout the centuries. That at one point we start judging everything based on what we know culturally instead of saying, well, listen, there's something else going on there. And I think that's a note. That's what we know as a glossary. This is what we call an editorial note, as they call it, to kind of calm the nerves of people that were reading this. But also, I think really what it's actually saying is that because she has born children, they don't need to be together anymore. He has no need to marry her, and he never officially married her anyhow. And it's there to kind of clarify that the deed of the levirate marriage was completed, and therefore he does not need to be with her anymore. But in any case, there are the whole question of relations between couples and everything. It's very interesting. It's a very complex field. It's very interesting. The Torah talks about this twice and repeats certain things, but then also avoids certain subjects. And really, when you look at the ancient Near East, there are plenty of items about marriage and sexual promiscuity and everything. But it's very, one of the more important points here as well is the difference between what we find in the ancient Near East and what we find in the Torah is the fact that these are not just social, this is not just a social thing, this is strongly connected to the covenant with God, and therefore this can be a deal breaker. If you practice these things, you have actually contaminated yourself, because the Torah, unlike the law codes in the ancient Near East, is also a code that is your covenant with your Creator, the covenant with your God. All of these laws that we find in the ancient Near East are based on the idea of only social structures. The Torah already takes also a covenant side to it, the covenant you have with your Creator, and therefore this can be a deal breaker. And even to this very day, sexuality is a very hot topic in most religious, quote unquote, communities. Because it is something that is perceived as being sometimes a deprivation when it is done incorrectly. And the Torah actually states this as well. So in any case, this is mixing of things. This is chaos. Some people ask, what is the prohibition of wearing shatnez, a mixture of wool and linen? It's an issue of chaos, bringing chaos back to the world, bringing lack of knowing who's the father of whom, and so on. So I can really say this entire book, this entire parasha is the parasha of repelling the chaos, preventing the chaos, bringing chaos down and letting order come into the universe. In any case, I hope you enjoyed this recording. As always, you can contact me either on the website HebrewInIsrael.net. If what I do here has blessed you, you can also donate. You can go to the website and donate. I'm also on Facebook, Hebrew in Israel. is the name of the Facebook page, and HebrewInIsrael@gmail.com is the email. Hope you enjoyed this. Any questions or any remarks or any constructive discussions are more than welcome. If you listen to this during Shabbat, Shabbat Shalom. If you listen before, so pre-Shabbat Shalom. And when I'm done with the sequence of the weekly portion, I'll have more time to discuss things. If you have specific questions that you want me to discuss, we're getting close to that time. It will be easier for me to do it. And also, I have several ideas for different series I'm thinking about. I'll decide eventually which one I want. I still have a couple of weeks to do this. And when I actually get to it, you'll see the announcement about it. Anyhow, again, thank you for joining me, and be blessed. Kol Tov.